Dad, that rotting boat shed of yours isn't fit for my wife to set foot in. My son sneered on Christmas Eve morning, before hanging up without waiting for an answer. He had no idea I owned a private island an hour's flight north of the mainland, or that his mother had left him a fortune I had kept sealed for 27 years, waiting to see if he would ever earn it. By nightfall, both secrets would cost him everything he believed he understood about his own life, and neither of us would walk away from that Christmas Eve unchanged. His seaplane cut its engines at 4 minutes past 4 that afternoon, and even before the pontoons touched the black water off Raven Ledge, I already knew exactly how the next 6 hours of my son's life were going to end. He didn't. He stepped out onto my dock in a wool coat that cost more than most men's trucks, chin lifted, already rehearsing the speech he had planned to give me about my failures. Behind him, his wife trailed a few steps back, her eyes doing quiet arithmetic on every stone and window and length of dock they passed. Neither of them noticed the man standing at the edge of the boathouse, still as a piling in a slack tide, watching them the way I used to watch a hull in rough water, waiting to see exactly where it would break first. They believed they had caught me hiding something. They had no idea what they had actually walked into. To understand how two people so sure of themselves ended up standing on a dock that belonged to a man they had spent years calling poor, I have to take you back to that same morning. Back to a phone ringing in an empty boat shed and a voice I wish even now I had never answered. The call came in at 8 minutes past 8, cutting through nothing but the hum of a space heater and the smell of linseed oil drying on old planking. I did not pick it up in time. By the time I wiped the sawdust from my hands and reached the workbench, the screen had already gone dark. One missed call and one voicemail sitting beneath it, both from my son Trevor. I pressed play and set the phone down on the bench beside a set of hull drawings I had not touched in 27 years. Dad, are you even going to listen to this one, or do I have to say it twice? Trevor's voice came through flat and impatient, already bored with me before he had said a single useful thing. I'm sending this because I don't have time for another one of your calls about Christmas traditions. Let's get one thing straight. Portia and I are not spending the most important holiday of the year in that rotting boat shed you call a home. It smells like turpentine and dead dreams, and it is not fit for my wife to set foot inside. I did not move. I had heard worse from him before. I had simply never heard it timed so precisely to land on the one morning I had already decided to stop pretending. Portia's father has an actual marina berth up north, the voicemail went on. Trevor's voice climbing into the register he used whenever he wanted an audience, even one that wasn't there. Commodore Merrick keeps a boathouse with a crew that actually knows how to polish brass and set a proper table. Do you honestly think I would bring my wife to eat dry turkey in a shed that still smells like the boat you never finished it? Is embarrassing, Dad. It is an insult to my standing. He had no idea that the man he was calling an embarrassment had once redesigned the keel on 3 America's Cup contenders before he turned 40. He had no idea about a great many things, and by the sound of his voice, he intended to keep it that way. I'm doing you a favor telling you this now, Trevor said, his voice dropping into something colder, something that had stopped asking and started demanding. We're spending Christmas with the Merricks this year. It's where people of our caliber belong, and don't bother texting me back with some guilt trip about family. Just make sure the card is loaded by noon. Portia wants to get something in Newport before the shops close, and I am not going to stand there explaining a decline to my own wife. There was a pause on the recording long enough that I thought it had ended. It hadn't. One more thing, he added, and I could hear the smile in it. The particular cruelty of a man who believes he has already won an argument no one else is having. Uncle Silas mentioned you've been spending a lot of time alone out on that shed of yours, talking to yourself about old boats. Maybe it's time you thought about who's going to take care of things when you can't anymore. I'm just saying it because I care. The voicemail reached its end the way it always did, with the knife turned one final quarter inch. Spending Christmas with a washed-up old man in a boat shed is a stain on my name, Dad. Enjoy your dinner alone. Some of us actually have a legacy to protect. The line clicked dead. In the quiet that followed, I heard the space heater tick, and somewhere above me in the rafters, the small, unfinished hull I had never let myself throw away creaked once against its ropes, the way it always did when the wind changed outside. I did not feel the anger I expected to feel. What I felt instead was something colder and far more useful, a clarity I had not allowed myself in longer than I could remember. I walked to the drawer beneath the workbench and pulled out a folder I had kept sealed for 3 weeks. It was not a folder about Christmas. It was not a folder about boats. It was the kind of folder that only mattered once a man had finally decided to stop being generous, and until that morning I had not been ready to open it. I did not open it yet. I only held it, feeling the weight of it in one hand, while my other hand found the edge of the old hull drawings on the bench, the ink gone soft brown with age. The same drawings I had made with a 9-year-old's small fingers wrapped around mine, guiding a pencil neither of us had known how to hold properly. 27 years, and the boat above me was still exactly as far from finished as the day we stopped building it together. 30 years, I thought, looking up at it. 30 years of letting him believe the man who built that boat had nothing left worth respecting. That was enough. I picked the phone back up and dialed my sister before I let myself think twice about it. Dottie answered on the second ring, her voice already sharp, already awake, in a way that meant she had been up reading legal briefs since 5. "It's 8:30 in the morning on Christmas Eve, Wendell. This had better be good news or a house fire." "It's neither," I said. "It's over." "What's over?" "The experiment. Trevor's little test of mine. It's finished. He just left a voicemail telling me my shed smells like turpentine and dead dreams, and that spending Christmas with a washed-up old man is a stain on his name." There was a pause on her end, the particular silence of a woman doing arithmetic on 30 years of patience running out all at once. "He actually said that. To your voicemail, in writing, essentially, in his own voice, time-stamped and everything." "Good," Dottie said, and I could hear the shift in her, the sound of a retired litigator remembering exactly how much she used to enjoy her work. "Good, then he's finally given us something we can use. What do you need from me?" I did not answer that right away. I walked to the back room of the shed instead, past the cold coffee pot and the drafting table, to the small, fireproof safe bolted beneath the floorboards. The one Trevor had never once asked about in 36 years, because he had never once wondered what his father might actually be worth. 3 weeks ago, I said, I had Halloran's firm quietly buy up every marker Trevor's run at Foxwoods over the last 2 years. $2,400,000, give or take, spread across a dozen different pit bosses, who all thought they were selling to a collections agency out of Providence. "You bought your own son's gambling debt." "I bought the paper, which means I bought the right to call it whenever I choose to call it. He thinks I don't know he's been playing high roller he can't afford. He has no idea I'm the one holding every marker." Dottie let out a short, dry laugh, the kind she usually saved for opposing counsel who had just made a mistake in open court. "You've been sitting on this for 3 weeks and you didn't tell me?" I wanted to be sure I was ready to use it. This morning he made sure of that for me. "All right," she said, and I could hear her already moving a drawer sliding open somewhere in her kitchen, papers shifting. "Tell me what today looks like." "I want the power of attorney revocation ready by 5. The new deed language too, the one we drafted in the spring and never filed. And call Roscoe. If Trevor tries to charter anything today, anything at all out of Bangor or Bar Harbor, I want it routed to Praxton, nobody else." Praxton doesn't take excuses from anyone, including me. That's precisely why I want him. Before Dottie could ask, I gave her the rest of it. 2 men in flight suits standing with him the moment the skids touched the pad. No confrontation, no raised voices, nothing anyone watching from the water could call a scene. Just a card that declines and a bill that doesn't move. Let Trevor do the shouting. I want the story to write itself. "You've thought about this a great deal longer than 3 weeks, Dottie said. And Estelle, tell her it's time. 1 photograph of the pool, nothing more. Location vague enough to tease, specific enough that a man who thinks he's clever will believe he's cracked a secret I never meant for him to find. I want Roscoe there tonight at the house, not just on the phone," I said, Estelle as well. And call Silas. Tell him to bring his good judgment along with his good wine, because before this night is finished, I may need a licensed professional in the room to say plainly just how sound my mind actually is. You think it's going to come to that? I think a man who's spent his whole life measuring people by their bank balance will reach for whatever weapon is closest once he realizes he's already lost. I would rather have the answer ready before he thinks to ask the question. Dottie went quiet again, and when she spoke this time, her voice had lost its edge. Dropped into something closer to the sister I had actually grown up with, the one who used to sit with me on the porch of our father's real house, the small one, the one that had nothing to do with any of this. Wendell, are you sure you're ready for where this ends? There's no version of today where he doesn't find out everything. The island, the money, all of it. He was always going to find out eventually, I said. I just didn't expect to be the one deciding when. You've kept this island a secret from your own son for 5 years. I've kept it a secret from everyone who ever asked me for something, instead of asking me how I was. He's never once asked how I was, Dottie. Not since his mother died, not once. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Somewhere behind me, through the thin wall of the shed, I could hear the tide starting to shift against the rocks. The sound I had built this whole quiet life around, the sound that meant nothing to my son at all. How long have you been waiting for this day? Dottie asked, quieter now. I looked out through the small window over the workbench, past the frost creeping up the glass, toward the water that eventually, an hour's flight north, became the water surrounding an island most people in this world did not know I owned. I did not answer her question. Some questions are better left where they are. Call Roscoe, I said instead. And Dottie, one more thing. Make sure the champagne on the island is already on ice. If Trevor wants to see what a real legacy looks like, I intend to show him one tonight, in full. It's already on ice, Wendell, she said. It has been for years. I ended the call and stood there a moment longer, looking at the safe still open at my feet. The folder of casino markers sitting on top of a stack of documents that would, by the end of the night, mean far more to my son than any of them yet understood. Then I closed it, locked it, checked the latch twice out of a habit older than my son, and went to find my coat. The notification chimed on my second monitor at 10 minutes past 10. Small and gray in the corner of a screen most people would never guess a man like me kept, running behind a bookshelf of maritime law texts. I had never told Trevor I still paid for the family data plan his phone wrote on. He had never asked who covered it, the same way he had never asked where the money for his allowance actually originated, or why a father who supposedly lived on a fixed pension could always somehow make a payment clear by noon. The plan came with a feature most providers buried 3 menus deep, a shared activity log meant for parents keeping track of teenagers. I had simply never turned it off. Estelle had posted the pool. I watched the message thread open on my screen in real time, the words arriving in small gray bubbles, like something surfacing from underwater. Trevor to Portia. Look at this. That's the same stonework from the blueprints in the old man's shed. I knew it. He hasn't been visiting clients up the coast. He's been building this the whole time. Portia to Trevor. Is that real? If that's his, it's worth tens of millions. Why would he live in that dump and hide this from us? Because he's a selfish, manipulative old man. Trevor wrote back. And I read the words twice, the way I used to reread a stress calculation that had come out wrong, looking for the exact point where the error had entered the equation. He's been sitting on this the whole time, probably planning to leave it all to some foundation just so we get nothing. We should go, Portia answered. If we're there in person, he can't lie his way out of it in front of his fancy friends. I set my coffee down and watched the thread go quiet for exactly 90 seconds. The length of time it took my son to search a charter company, find their number, and place a call I could have predicted the content of before he finished dialing. The activity log picked up the transaction 11 minutes later. A card authorization, $22,000, a regional seaplane charter departure that afternoon. Destination coordinates matching almost exactly the blurred tag on Estelle's photograph. He had not even asked what the flight would cost before booking it. He never did. Trevor to Portia. Booked it. We'll be there by early afternoon. He can't deny it to my face once we're standing in it. Portia to Trevor. Are you sure about this? If he's really been hiding something this big, he's not going to enjoy being caught. I don't care if he enjoys it, my son wrote. I care about what's actually mine. Portia to Trevor. What about tonight? My father's expecting us at the marina by 6. Trevor to Portia. Tell him something came up. This is more important than another one of his dinners where he talks about boats he doesn't actually own. I sat with that particular exchange longer than the others. Commodore Ansel Merrick had been expecting his daughter and son-in-law at his marina berth every Christmas Eve for 3 years running. And in 3 years, Trevor had never once canceled on him for any reason at all. He was canceling now for a stretch of gray ledge in a photograph with the location blurred out. I filed the detail away the way I filed away most things that afternoon, without comment, without reaction. Simply a fact placed on a shelf to be retrieved later when it would matter considerably more than it did in that moment. She did not answer the flight comment for almost 4 minutes. I have wondered since exactly what she did in those 4 minutes. Whether she reached for the small brass compass she wore at her throat, the one she called a family heirloom to anyone who asked, and turned it once between her fingers, the way a person does when they are thinking harder than they want anyone to notice. She had worn that compass to every dinner I had ever sat through with her, always angled just so under the light of the story behind it changing slightly depending on who was listening. A grandfather's ship in one version, a great-uncle's naval commission in another. I would learn much later just how little of that compass, or anything else she claimed as inherited, had ever actually come from a family at all. Whatever she decided in those 4 minutes, she went back to packing. Trevor to Portia. Don't worry about the cost. I have his card. The limit's $50,000. Let him pay for the flight to his own funeral. I read that line 3 times before I closed the laptop. He had chosen his own words. Nobody had put them in his mouth. Whatever happened on that dock in a few hours, he would not be able to say later that his father had cornered him into anything. He had walked toward this entirely on his own, typing it out in a kitchen 2 states south, certain he had finally outsmarted a man he had never once bothered to actually understand. I pulled up the villa's approach radar instead, a small application I had built myself years ago for tracking weather off the point, repurposed now for a different kind of storm. A single red mark appeared on the northeast edge of the screen, moving slow and steady, climbing toward altitude. I had drawn up 3 separate versions of this afternoon over the past 3 weeks, 3 different ways my son might find his way to Raven Ledge, each one requiring a different arrangement of pilots, paperwork, and patience. I had hoped, without much conviction, that none of them would ever be needed. Watching the red mark climb now, I understood I had simply been waiting to find out which version of my son would show up when the moment finally arrived. And he had just answered the question for me in his own handwriting, without my having to ask it once. The flight plan had been filed. The card had cleared. My son was 3 hours from a runway he did not yet know led directly to me. The bait had been swallowed whole, and for the first time since 8 o'clock that morning, I allowed myself something that was not quite a smile, but was closer to one than anything I had felt in years. I closed the laptop, poured the rest of the cold coffee down the drain, and went to see about a dock that had not needed clearing in months but would by early afternoon need to look exactly as it always did, as though nothing on this island had ever been waiting for anyone. The wind off Raven Ledge came in hard and salt-bitten and cold by the time the seaplane's engines finally cut, kicking a fine mist across the boathouse windows where I stood watching from the shadows. From that angle, the aircraft looked exactly like what it was. A machine carrying 2 people who believed they were arriving to claim something, with no idea they were about to be handed a bill for the privilege. I had built this dock myself 12 years ago, laying the pilings by hand with a crew of 3 men and a barge that had seen better decades. I had never once imagined back then that its first real test would be holding the weight of my own son's arrival like an invading force, wool coat and borrowed confidence and all. I watched the pontoon settle against the dock, watched the door slide open, watched my son step out first. Trevor adjusted the collar of a wool coat I happened to know retailed for close to $4,000, though he had never once in his life paid full price for anything himself. He paused at the top of the gangway, chin lifted, scanning the island's architecture with the particular squint of a man doing quiet math on square footage. His chest rose and fell like he already owned the air he was breathing. Portia came down behind him, heels finding the wet planking with more care than her husband bothered to show. Her eyes moved fast, cataloging the infinity pool visible past the boathouse, the staff moving on the lower terrace, the sheer glass face of the main house rising out of the ledge like something that had grown there instead of being built. They did not look like family arriving for Christmas. They looked like a pair of surveyors inspecting a property they had already decided belonged to them. "Would you look at this place, Portia?" Trevor called over the dying whine of the rotors, loud enough that I could hear him clearly through the boathouse window. "He held out on us this whole time. This isn't a house, it's a gold mine." "We are going to have a great deal to discuss over dinner." He started toward the covered walkway that led down to the main house, moving with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life been told no by anyone who mattered. He did not get far. Paxton stepped out from the far side of the aircraft, a broad, unhurried man in a charter uniform, who had flown special operations before he had ever flown for money, and he planted himself directly in Trevor's path with a handheld payment terminal already glowing red in one hand. "Mr. Vance." Paxton's voice carried the flat, unbothered authority of a man who had delivered this exact sentence to wealthier people than my son and watched it land the same way every time. "There's a problem with the transaction." Trevor stopped mid-stride, his sneer faltering for exactly 1 second before the arrogance rebuilt itself brick by brick in front of me. "Don't be ridiculous. That's my father's account. Run it again." Paxton tapped the screen. The terminal answered with a short, flat beep that seemed to carry farther than it should have across the open water. "It's not a technical error, sir. The card was deactivated 11 minutes ago." Deactivated. Trevor repeated the word like it belonged to a language he had never bothered to learn. "That's not possible. That card has a $50,000 limit. It doesn't get deactivated." Portia stepped closer, her composure cracking at the edges. "Trevor, do something. This is humiliating. There are staff watching us from the terrace." "I'm handling it," he snapped, not looking at her. His attention fixed entirely on Paxton, as though sufficient volume alone might change the number sitting on the screen in front of him. "Run it again. I don't care what it says. Run it again." Paxton did not run it again. He simply stood there, patient as a man who had spent a career being shouted at by people who never once changed the outcome by shouting. I watched my son's face from behind the glass close enough now that I could see every stage of it happening in real time. The confusion, the disbelief, the first thin crack of something closer to fear. Portia's hand tightened on the strap of her bag. Neither of them looked toward the boathouse. Neither of them yet understood that the man they had come to catch in a lie was standing 11 feet away, watching them discover the truth for themselves. "There's been a mistake," Trevor said, though his voice had lost most of its certainty. "Call my father, he'll sort this out." "I intend to," Paxton said, and did not move an inch. $22,000, sir. Cash or wire transfer, or my company policy requires I hold you here until it clears." "I don't carry that kind of cash on a holiday," Trevor said. And for the first time since stepping off the plane, something in his posture folded just slightly. The chest that had been puffed out on the gangway, sinking an inch under the weight of a number he could not simply talk his way past. "You don't understand who I am. My father designed half the harbors on this coast. He owns this entire island, every stone of it." "Then he can settle the account," Paxton said, unmoved. "I don't take promises, Mr. Vance. I take payment, and I have all afternoon to wait for it." Trevor turned in a slow circle, searching the empty dock, the closed elevator doors, the silent windows of a house he had spent the last 3 hours believing was finally, rightfully, about to become his. He found no one. Only wind and water and a bill he had no way to pay. "Dad!" he shouted, his voice cracking against the salt air aimed at windows that gave nothing back. "Dad! I know you're watching. Open the door. Tell this man there's been a mix-up." The only answer was the wind and the distant muffled sound of laughter drifting down from somewhere inside the house guests, already arriving for a dinner Trevor did not yet know he had never been invited to. I let him stand there a moment longer, watching the panic finally start to work its way past the arrogance, before I stepped out from the shadows of the boathouse and started down the walkway, my footsteps landing slow and even against the stone, each one sounding in the stillness, very much like a decision that had already been made a long time ago. I did not hurry. There was no reason to. My son was not going anywhere, not with $22,000 standing between him and the only door on the island that led out of the cold. I had pictured this walk more times than I cared to admit over the past 3 weeks. Rehearsed it the way I used to rehearse a difficult presentation before a client who held the fate of a project in one signature. I had never quite decided in any of those private rehearsals whether I wanted to feel triumphant when the moment finally arrived. Standing on the walkway now, watching my son's shoulders tighten as I approached, I found I felt neither triumph nor satisfaction. I felt only the particular stillness of a man finally setting down a weight he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten what it was like to stand up straight without it. Trevor's head snapped toward me the moment I cleared the boathouse shadow, and for one unguarded second, something close to relief broke across his face. The expression of a drowning man who has just spotted a rope. "Dad, thank God." He started toward me, already talking, before I was within 20 feet. "Tell this man there's been a mistake with the card. We can sort out the house and everything else inside all right, just pay him." I stopped a few feet away and looked at him the way I used to look at a hull that had come back from sea trials with a crack running through the frame. Not with anger, but with the particular clarity of a man calculating exactly how deep the damage went and whether it could ever be trusted on open water again. A mistake. I repeated, my voice barely rising above the wind, though it carried anyway. "No, Trevor, there's no mistake. I deactivated that card myself the moment your pilot filed the flight plan. I believe it's time you learned that being authorized on an account is a privilege, not a right." I watched the words land. I watched them travel the entire distance from his ears to whatever was left of his composure, and I watched that composure collapse in real time, the same way I had once watched a beam give way under a load it had never been engineered to hold. "You," he said, and his voice had gone thin, almost childlike. "You did this. On purpose." "I did," I said, and let the silence stretch a moment before going on, letting the ocean do most of the talking for me. "You called me a washed-up old man this morning, Trevor. You said being around me was an insult to your standing. I simply assumed a man of your caliber wouldn't need my money to cover a simple flight." Portia's eyes darted between us, calculating the way they always did when a room's balance of power shifted, and she needed to decide quickly and quietly which side of the shift she wanted to be standing on when the dust finally settled. She stepped forward, softening her voice into the particular register she used whenever she wanted something from a man who wasn't her husband. "Wendell, please, this is all just a misunderstanding. Trevor gets emotional, that's all. Surely you won't leave your only son standing out here on Christmas Eve like a stranger." I did not look at her long. "I found his voicemail quite clear this morning. He was very concerned about his social standing. He mentioned your father's marina berth and how a man of his caliber shouldn't have to eat dry turkey in a shed that smells like dead dreams." Her smile faltered. "I'm just a poor, washed-up old man, remember?" I said, turning back to Trevor. "This rotting boat shed of mine hardly seems like the kind of place a man of your caliber would want to be seen standing outside of begging." "Dad, I was stressed," Trevor said, his voice climbing, cracking at the edges. "I didn't mean any of it. We're here now. We came to celebrate with you." "With a man you called an insult to your reputation 4 hours ago." I let that sit in the cold air between us. "That reputation you're so worried about protecting. I'd hate to stain it further by inviting you inside somewhere so cramped and pathetic." "Come on, Dad, that's not fair." Trevor tried a different approach, softer now, the wounded younger son instead of the entitled one. A switch I had watched him make 100 times over the years, whenever anger stopped working on me. "Family says things they don't mean sometimes. Isn't that what you always used to tell me growing up? That family forgives?" "Family also tells the truth to each other," I said. "You told me the truth this morning, whether you intended to or not. I'm simply returning the favor. Trevor tried one more time, his voice sliding into something closer to pleading than I had heard from him since he was 9 years old and afraid of the dark in a house that no longer exists. Just pay the pilot, Dad. Please. We'll talk about everything else after. I'm freezing out here. I looked past him toward Praxton, who had not moved from his post beside the aircraft, and toward the warm light already spilling from the grand gallery windows behind me, where the first of my real guests had begun to arrive. I let my son stand in the cold a moment longer than I needed to, not out of cruelty, though I understood how it might have looked, but because some lessons only take root in exactly this kind of weather. You'll find, I said finally, that some truths are better delivered in front of an audience than in private. I have guests arriving for dinner. I think it's time you met them. I turned and pressed the small remote in my coat pocket. Behind me, the heavy glass doors of the main house began to slide open, warmth and firelight and the low hum of conversation spilling out onto the stone walkway. The pilot stays paid until he's paid in full, I added, glancing once more at Praxton, who gave the smallest nod in return. You're welcome to explain the rest of your evening to him yourselves, once dinner is finished. Trevor stared at the open doors, then at me, then back at the doors, calculating the way he always calculated, searching for the angle that would let him walk through them without having to actually admit anything had changed. I watched him do it, the same small, familiar arithmetic I had watched him run since he was a boy, weighing pride against comfort, and finding, as he always did, that comfort won out in the end. Coming? I asked, already turning my back on both of them, already walking toward the warmth and the fire, and the people who had never once needed a deactivated card to understand exactly who I was. Behind me, I heard Portia's heels against the stone, hesitant at first, then quicker, unwilling to be the one left standing on the dock. Trevor followed a half-second later, and though I did not turn to watch him do it, I heard it clearly enough in the rhythm of his footsteps, the particular shuffle of a man walking somewhere he no longer trusted, into a house he had spent his whole life believing he already owned, and would soon discover he had never once set foot inside of. Not really. Not until tonight. The grand gallery had already filled with the particular warmth of people who understood exactly what they were worth and had long since stopped needing to announce it. Cedar burned low in the hearth at the far end of the room. Crystal caught the light from a chandelier I had spent an entire winter arguing with an electrician about. Roscoe Fenwick stood near the bar in a sweater that cost more than it looked like it should already, deep in conversation with Estelle Marchetti, who had traded her tablet for a glass of something dark and expensive, and appeared for the moment entirely present in the room, rather than 3 platforms deep in someone else's feed. Silas hovered near the mantel, watching the door the way he watched everything, with the quiet, clinical patience of a man who had spent 30 years learning that people revealed the most about themselves in the 5 seconds before they knew they were being observed. Roscoe ran the largest fleet of tow and rescue vessels between Eastport and Bar Harbor, which meant in practical terms that there was scarcely a boat on this stretch of coast that changed hands, sank, or fell behind on its mooring fees without his knowing about it within the week. Estelle's magazine reached every yacht club board from Bar Harbor to Newport, the kind of quiet institutional readership that decided, without ever quite saying so out loud, who belonged in a marina and who merely wished they did. Between the two of them and Silas's steady clinical eye watching from the mantel, I had assembled, without ever calling it that to their faces, the only board of directors I had ever actually trusted. Trevor walked in like a man determined to reclaim ground he had already lost, chest forward, chin high, Portia trailing a step behind him with her composure stitched back together just well enough to pass at a distance. "There's been a ridiculous mix-up with the bank," Trevor announced to the room at large, to no one in particular, the way he always spoke when he wanted an audience larger than the one actually paying attention to him. "As I was telling my father, but regardless of a minor glitch with the seaplane, we're thrilled to be here, truly." He found an empty chair at the long table and claimed it before anyone offered it to him. "My wife Portia, as some of you may know, comes from the Callaway line. Her father, Commodore Merrick, was just mentioning how much he admires the architecture out this way. Roscoe did not look up from his glass. We spent the last few holidays at their marina, actually, Portia added, lifting her chin toward Estelle in a way she clearly hoped read as gracious rather than desperate. It's quite a change of pace, coming somewhere so well modest. But we wanted to check on Wendell. My father-in-law has been talking for months about expanding his fleet, Trevor continued, undeterred by the silence, filling it instead with more of his own voice, the way he always did whenever a room refused to give him the reaction he expected. He's mentioned bringing on new investors, real ones, people who understand what a legacy is worth. I told him he should consider some of you, actually. It's the kind of opportunity that doesn't come around twice. Estelle's expression did not change at all, which somehow communicated more than if it had. Her stillness itself a kind of verdict she did not need to say aloud. The table remained silent. Roscoe examined the color of his whiskey as though it contained something worth studying. Estelle simply raised one eyebrow, cool and unhurried, and turned her attention back to the fire. A mistake. I repeated silently to myself the same two words he had used out on the dock an hour earlier, filing away the echo the way I filed away most things that evening. For later, when it would matter considerably more than it did right now. I set my own fork down beside my plate slowly, the sound of silver against porcelain landing in the quiet room with considerably more weight than the gesture deserved. Portia, I said, my voice pitched low enough that the whole table had to lean in slightly to catch it, which was, of course, precisely the effect I wanted. That's an interesting word, modest. For a man who hasn't used the same last name in 3 different countries? Trevor laughed, a jagged, nervous sound that fooled no one at the table. Dad, you're getting confused. Maybe all this time alone on the island is starting to get to you. Commodore Merrick is a pillar of the sailing community up and down this coast. His pillar, I said, is currently under federal review, Trevor. But we'll get to that after the first course. Roscoe finally looked up, and for the first time since Trevor had entered the room, something close to interest crossed his face. Sharp and quiet, the look of a man who had spent 30 years around boats and knew precisely which ones were seaworthy and which ones only looked that way from the dock. He set his glass down without a word and glanced toward me. A small, deliberate look that told me he had already begun connecting a piece of information I had not yet asked him to share. Silas set down his own glass with a small, deliberate click. Wendell, he said, his voice even clinical, the voice he used with patience and with family in equal measure. Would you like me to say something now? Or should we let the evening unfold as planned? Let it unfold, Silas, I said. There's no reason to rush a lesson my son has spent 36 years refusing to learn. Trevor's smile had begun to falter at the edges, though he was still trying gamely to hold it in place, the way a man holds a door shut against a wind he has not yet realized has already gotten inside the house. Portia's hand found the stem of her wineglass and gripped it a fraction too tightly, her knuckles pale against the crystal, though she said nothing at all. She had gone quiet, in a way that felt different from Trevor's silence, less wounded pride, more the particular stillness of a woman recalculating quickly exactly how much of her earlier confidence she could still afford to spend in this room. I looked around the table once more at Roscoe and Estelle and Silas, at the small, deliberate silence they had built around my son, without any of them saying a single unkind word to his face. And I understood, not for the first time that evening, exactly why I had spent 30 years surrounding myself with people who required no explanation for who I actually was. None of them had asked to see the house before deciding I was worth their time. None of them had ever once mentioned an allowance, a card, or a limit. Now, I said, reaching for the small remote I had kept in my pocket since the moment I sat down, my thumb finding the button by feel alone, without needing to look. I believe it's time we discuss the Commodore in a bit more detail. Behind me I heard the faint mechanical hum of the gallery's largest window beginning its slow transformation from glass to screen, and across the table I watched my son's face catch the first cold flicker of light before he had any idea at all what he was about to see. The glass wall behind me had gone fully dark now. 30 feet of tempered pain transformed into the largest screen most of my guests had ever seen assembled outside a boardroom. A feature I had originally installed for displaying nautical charts and hull renderings. Never once imagining its first real use would be dismantling a man's entire fabricated bloodline in front of his own son. A document appeared, red-bordered, official, the kind of formatting that made even people who had never read a federal filing understand immediately that they were looking at something serious. Interpol Red Notice, the header read. And beneath it a name that was not Commodore Ansel Merrick at all. Arthur Merrick Higgins, I said, letting the name sit in the room the way I had let so many other things sit in it that night. Wanted on 11 counts of wire fraud and the operation of a maritime investment scheme that collapsed 4 months ago. The Coast Guard's Financial Crimes Division has been building this case for the better part of a year, quietly, the same way most serious things get built. The name on your wedding invitation, Portia, was never the name on his passport. Trevor's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. He looked for one unguarded moment, exactly as he had looked as a boy of 9 years old, standing in the doorway of a hospital room he had not wanted to enter, waiting for someone else to tell him what to feel about something he did not yet have the tools to understand on his own. I recognized the expression instantly, and it cost me more than I expected it to, seeing it resurface now in a grown man's face over a fortune that had never once been real. I had spent 30 years hoping I would never see that particular expression on him again, and here it was anyway, arriving for entirely the wrong reason at entirely the wrong moment. The marina berth you mentioned, I continued, my eyes on him now, not on the screen, because I had already seen what the screen had to show, and I found I was considerably more interested in watching my son see it for the first time. Currently under federal lien, every vessel in it seized 3 weeks ago. The only reason your father-in-law isn't sitting in a holding cell right now is that he's hiding somewhere in the Maritimes, using whatever funds he can still access to pay for an encrypted satellite phone. This is a lie, Portia said, though her voice had lost every trace of the melodic confidence it had carried an hour earlier out on the dock. You're jealous. You're a boat builder who never made partner at anything. My father built an empire. An empire, I repeated, letting the words sit for a moment, in the same tone I might use to examine a piling that had rotted through from the inside while looking sound from the surface. Built on other people's retirement accounts, Portia. I've seen the filings. 31 investors, most of them retired fishermen, and their widows, all of whom believed they were buying into a legitimate charter fleet. You're making this up to humiliate us in front of your friends. Your father, I said, built a fiction, and married you into a family he thought would help him hide it a little longer. I happen to know quite a lot about the specific empire he built, Portia, because I am currently the lead donor for the Maritime Victims Advocacy Fund, paying the legal team assembling his indictment. I've read every page of what he did to those people. I imagine you never have. He gave me everything, Portia said, her voice climbing now, the polish finally cracking entirely. The name, the connections, the life I was supposed to have. You don't know what it's like to grow up watching your father build something out of nothing. I know precisely what that's like, I said. The difference, Portia, is that I built mine out of lumber and steel, and 30 years of my own 2 hands, most of them spent alone, in a shed you found embarrassing this morning. Your father built his out of other people's retirement checks. Those are not the same thing, no matter how similar they might have looked from the outside of a marina dressed up in the right coat. I watched the words land the way I had watched every other reveal land that night, tracking the exact moment understanding overtook denial on both their faces. Trevor's hand found the back of his chair and gripped it. Portia's breath caught audibly sharp enough that Roscoe glanced her way for the first time all evening. You wanted heritage, Trevor, I said, turning fully toward him now. You wanted status and reputation and a family whose name meant something. Well, there it is, on the wall behind me. A fugitive and a fraud. That's the heritage you traded your own father for, and you didn't even have the sense to check whether it was real before you traded me for it. I didn't know. Trevor said the words coming out smaller than anything he had said all evening, something almost childlike surfacing beneath the wreckage of his composure. How could I have known? You didn't ask, I said. That's the part I find hardest to forgive. Not that you were wrong about him, that you never once thought to ask. Portia's wine glass slipped from her fingers. It struck the white marble floor and shattered a bright, brittle crack that cut through the silence of the room. Red wine blossoming across the stone in a shape that looked, for one long second, like something far worse than spilled wine. She stood frozen above it, staring at the mess, at the screen, at Trevor, at me, her carefully built identity coming apart in real time in front of a table full of people who had never once needed to see it to know exactly what it was worth. No one moved at all to help her. The fire cracked once in the hearth, and somewhere beyond the glass, muffled by 30 feet of tempered pain and the sound of the tide, a gull called out twice over open water and went quiet again. Roscoe turned his glass slowly in his hand, saying nothing. Estelle's eyes stayed fixed on the wine soaking into the stone, unreadable. Silas simply watched the way he always watched, cataloging, without comment. A waiter appeared at the edge of the room, hesitated, and did not move closer until I gave the smallest nod. No one reached for a napkin before that, no one spoke at all, and the silence stretched long enough that the dripping of the wine off the edge of the shattered crystal became for a moment the loudest sound in the room, each drop landing with a small, unhurried patience that felt somehow crueler than anything I could have said aloud. "Trevor," I said finally quietly, once the waiter had begun moving in to clear the glass from the floor. "Don't look so shocked. We haven't even reached the legal paperwork yet. There's considerably more to come before this evening is finished, and I'd advise you to sit down for the rest of it." He turned toward the grand entrance instead, his face a contorted mask of shame and panic, moving fast, as though putting distance between himself and the wreckage of his wife's identity might somehow undo what he had just watched happen to it. He made it 3 steps before he seemed to remember all at once that the only way off this island belonged entirely to me, and his stride broke, faltering, into something closer to a stumble. The particular walk of a man who has just realized, mid-flight, that there is nowhere left to run to. He did not make it to the entrance. Dottie stepped out from the shadow of the library archway, blocking his path with the quiet, unhurried authority of a woman who had spent 30 years standing between guilty men and the doors they wanted to reach. She was not carrying a glass of champagne. She carried Marion's old leather briefcase instead, the one that had sat untouched in a closet for 27 years, until I asked her 3 weeks ago to take it out again and dust off the clasp. I had watched her carry that briefcase exactly twice before tonight in my entire life. Both times for reasons that had nothing to do with Trevor and everything to do with a woman neither of us had spoken about at any real length in decades. Not since the funeral. Not since the years right after it when neither of us had known what to say to the other about any of it. Seeing it now, sitting on my own dining table, under the weight of an entirely different reckoning, felt like watching 2 separate rooms of my life quietly begin to fold into one. "Going somewhere, Trevor?" Dottie asked, setting the briefcase down on the edge of the mahogany table with a soft, final thud. "I thought you wanted to discuss your status. I believe those were your exact words to your father this morning." Trevor stopped, chest heaving, his eyes darting between Dottie and the closed elevator doors behind her doing the same. Fast, desperate math I had watched him run twice already that evening and lose both times. He glanced once toward the terrace, as though calculating whether he could make it to the water before anyone stopped him. Then seemed to remember there was nowhere on this island that led anywhere but back to me. "I'm leaving," he said, though his voice had lost most of its conviction. "I don't have to listen to any of this. I'll call for a boat myself. I'll sue for my share of the estate." "Your share." Dottie let out a short, dry laugh, the kind she used to save for opposing counsel, who had just handed her exactly the opening she needed. She opened the briefcase and began laying documents across the table, one after another, each one stamped with the seal of a Connecticut Gaming Commission and the logo of a casino I doubted Trevor wanted to hear named out loud in front of this particular audience. "You've spent years calling your father an ATM," she said. "Years treating 30 years of quiet, patient generosity like a bottomless well that owed you a lifetime of withdrawals. But while you were busy playing the high roller at Foxwoods, Flying up on weekends you told your wife were business trips, you forgot something rather important. Every debt eventually finds its way home, Trevor. Every single one. She fanned the papers out across the table like a losing hand of cards, which I supposed was exactly what they were. A hand played badly and repeatedly by a man who had never once had to face the dealer himself. $2,400,000, Trevor, she said, tapping the highlighted totals with one finger. Markers from the tables. High-stakes losses you never once mentioned to your wife or to your father, or to anyone at all. Not even when the collection calls started coming in twice a week. You assumed they'd simply disappear if you ignored them long enough. You assumed the Merricks would cover the shortfall, eventually, with money that, as it turns out, never existed in the first place. Any more than the man's title did. Trevor stared at the documents, his eyes widening as he recognized the signatures scrawled across each one. Loose and arrogant, unmistakably his own. How? He said, his voice cracking on the single syllable. How did you even get these? These are private records. They were private, I said, stepping fully into the light beside my sister. Until 3 weeks ago. Through a firm I control, quietly, the same way I've built almost everything on this island, I purchased every single one of your outstanding markers. I didn't just buy the paper, Trevor. I bought the legal right to collect on it, to garnish whatever wages you don't actually earn, to force a liquidation of anything you hold in your own name. I am no longer simply the father you've spent your whole life resenting. I am the man who owns your debt. That's not possible at all, Trevor said, though the words carried no real conviction behind them. The protest of a man arguing with arithmetic rather than an opinion. You don't have that kind of money. You live in a boat shed. You drive a truck that's older than my marriage. I drove that truck for 20 years because I wanted to see whether you would ever ask me a single question about the man behind the wheel of it, rather than the money you assumed wasn't there, I said. You never did. Not once in 36 years did you ask your father how he was doing. You only ever asked what he could send you and by what date, and whether it would clear before the shops closed. Portia had drifted closer during the exchange. Her earlier composure entirely abandoned now, watching the documents on the table. With the particular hunger of a woman recalculating in real time exactly how much of her husband's future was still worth staying attached to, and how quickly she might need to find somewhere else to stand. I did not tell him in that moment exactly how far back the accounting truly went, or what else had been quietly waiting in that same briefcase for 27 years, untouched, unmentioned, tied to a name he had not spoken aloud since he was 9 years old. There would be time enough for that later, in a colder room with far fewer witnesses. Tonight was not the night for that particular reckoning, and I intended to keep it that way for as long as I possibly could, no matter how close the truth of it sat right there on the table between us, folded quietly beneath $2 million of far easier evidence. You don't owe me for a helicopter you never should have chartered, Trevor, I said instead, my voice as steady as a keel laid true. You owe me for an entire life you've spent wasting. One marker at a time, one excuse at a time, one Christmas at a time. Trevor stumbled backward, one hand finding the edge of the table to steady himself, his face draining of whatever color the evening had left in it. He looked for the first time all night, less like a man defending his pride and more like a man watching the floor genuinely give way beneath him. The specific vertigo of discovering that the ground he had always assumed was solid had in fact belonged to someone else the entire time. You're a monster, he whispered, his voice barely carrying across the quiet room. How does a father do this to his own son? I let the accusation hang in the air a moment before answering it, the fire behind me cracking once in the silence. A father who spent 30 years quietly buying back every debt you refuse to face isn't the monster in this room, Trevor, I said. I would be careful about which of us you point that word at tonight, given the company you brought with you. Roscoe had drifted nearer during the exchange, saying nothing, his glass long since forgotten on the mantel. Estelle stood near the window with her arms folded, watching Trevor, the way a woman watches a story finally reach the part everyone already suspected was coming. Whatever sympathy the room might have held for my son an hour earlier had drained out of it entirely, replaced now by the particular quiet that settles over a group of people who have just watched a debt come due in front of them and understood without needing to say so that it was long overdue. Roscoe caught my elbow before I could follow the room's attention back to Trevor. He drew me a few steps toward the hallway, out of easy earshot. His voice dropped low into the register he used for things he did not want repeated at full volume. "Wendell, I need a minute." "Now isn't the ideal time, Roscoe," I said, my attention still half on the dining room behind us, where my son's voice had begun to rise again into something closer to a wounded animal than a man. "It's exactly the right time," he said, and something in his tone made me actually look at him instead of half listening while my attention stayed on my son. That yacht Trevor kept bragging about at the table. The Merrick boat. The one he called his father-in-law's private fleet. My crew towed it out of its slip in Camden 3 weeks ago. Federal seizure, same case Dottie's been circling all night. It's sitting in a holding yard in Rockland right now. Deregistered engines, stripped for parts, waiting on an auction date nobody's bothered to set yet. I said nothing for a moment, turning the information over, the way I used to turn over a stress report before signing off on a hull design, looking for the place where the weight actually landed. 3 weeks ago now, I said. Same week you bought up his markers, if the timing means anything to you. Roscoe's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Small world up here. Everybody's business ends up crossing everybody else's dock eventually, whether they like it or not. Does Trevor know the boat's gone? I asked, keeping my voice level, though the question carried more weight than my tone let on. Not from me. I doubt Merrick told his own daughter, let alone his son-in-law. Man like that keeps his losses quiet, right up until somebody forces the accounting out into daylight. Same as most men who've spent their whole lives borrowing a reputation instead of earning one. Roscoe glanced past me toward the dining room, where Trevor's voice had risen again, thinner now, unraveling at the edges. Figured you'd want to know before you decided how much more of tonight he actually needs to sit through. I did not answer right away. There was a particular satisfaction in holding a piece of information back, letting it sit fully formed and ready, rather than spending it the moment it arrived. I had learned that patience the hard way over 30 years of watching men rush their best evidence into a room before the room was ready to receive it, and losing whatever advantage the timing might have given them as a result. Keep it for now, I said. There's a version of tonight where that detail matters considerably more than it would in this particular minute. Save it for when he's run out of everything else to hide behind. Roscoe nodded, unbothered, the nod of a man who had long since stopped needing explanations for how I chose to run my own house. He drifted back toward the mantel without another word, glass already refilled by a passing waiter, and I turned to find Trevor still arguing with the empty air where Dottie had been standing. His voice pitched somewhere between fury and disbelief, directed now at no one in particular, the last of the guests near him drifting quietly toward the far end of the table, rather than continue standing witness to it. I did not go back to him immediately. Instead, I noticed Portia first, several feet away from her husband. Close enough to have heard everything. Far enough to have already begun deciding what she wanted to do with it. She had gone very still. The particular stillness of a woman recalculating an entire evening's strategy in the space of a few seconds. Weighing a husband who had just been revealed as a debtor and the fraudulent son of a fugitive, against a father-in-law who had, apparently, been sitting on considerably more resources than either of them had ever imagined. She caught my eye once briefly, and something in her expression shifted, the practiced warmth draining out of it, and something colder, more calculating, sliding into place behind her eyes instead. It was not grief. It was not even embarrassment on her husband's behalf. It was the look of a woman doing the same fast arithmetic I had just watched Roscoe hand me. The final figures for. Except her equation had an entirely different variable sitting at the center of it, and I suspected, watching her watch me, that I already knew what it was. I had seen that particular look before, though rarely aimed so precisely in my direction. It was the look of someone standing on a deck they had just realized was taking on water, already scanning the horizon for the next boat close enough to swim to, calculating the distance, the current, and whether the swim itself was even survivable before committing to it. I turned and walked toward the quiet of my library, instead of back toward the noise of the gallery, needing for just a moment the particular silence of old paper and dying firelight, before whatever came next arrived to interrupt it. The gallery behind me had begun to fill again, with the low murmur of conversation resuming. Guests deciding tactfully to give the evening's central drama a few minutes to breathe before the next course arrived. I did not make it more than a few steps down the hallway before I heard her heels behind me, quick and deliberate on the stone, closing the distance with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent her entire adult life learning exactly how to follow a man worth following.
"Wendell?" Portia said softly, just behind my shoulder.
"I need to talk to you. Alone." I did not stop walking, though I slowed enough to let her fall into step beside me. Curious, in spite of, to hear precisely what version of herself she intended to offer me once we were finally out of anyone else's earshot. Wondering, not for the first time that night, how many different versions of Portia Calloway actually existed behind that one carefully composed face. Behind us, the sound of the party continued, warm and distant, entirely unaware that the evening's real turning point had just quietly slipped out through a side hallway, following me toward a room lined with books neither Trevor nor his wife had ever once asked to read. The library still smelled the way it always did. Old vellum and beeswax, and the faint, lingering trace of wood smoke from a fire I had let burn low earlier in the evening. I walked to the mahogany desk and stood with my back to her, watching the embers pulse in the hearth, waiting to see exactly which version of the snake had decided to shed its skin tonight, and how long it would take her to get to the point of it. "I'm not on his side, Wendell," Portia said, her voice stripped of the brittle socialite trill she had used all evening. Something flatter and more careful sliding into its place. "I need you to know that. I never was, not really. Not since I understood what he actually was underneath all of it." "Not really," I said without turning around, letting the silence stretch a beat longer than was comfortable, curious to see whether she would fill it. She did. I heard the small click of a clasp, and when I finally turned to face her, she was holding a slim recording device, palm-sized, the kind meant to disappear inside an evening bag, without anyone ever noticing it was there in the first place. There was a particular light in her eyes, the look of a woman who had spent the last several hours watching her chosen ship take on water and had at last decided it was time to produce the map she'd been saving for exactly this occasion. "Trevor's a fool," she said, her voice dropping into something low and conspiratorial, leaning slightly closer, as though the confession itself might buy her something. "Weak, entitled, predictable in every way that matters. I've known for months he was steering us both toward a cliff. I'm not like him. I value what you've built out here. I understood the vision the moment I saw it from the seaplane." "And you have proof of this newfound devotion, I take it?" Without another word, she pressed play. The recording was 6 months old, captured by the sound of it, in a city apartment during a rainy afternoon. Trevor's voice thinner and more calculated than the version I'd been hearing all night. A voice that believed it had already won. "The old man's getting erratic, Portia, spending more time alone, talking about legacy, about vision. It's the perfect opening. I've already spoken to a lawyer who specializes in elder competency. We just need a few more documented incidents. A missed appointment. A forgotten conversation." I felt something settle cold in my chest that had nothing to do with the fire having burned low. "Once he's committed," the recording continued, Trevor's voice dripping with an ease that made my stomach turn, "the power of attorney kicks in. We liquidate the city assets first, but the island, Portia, the island is the real prize. No more begging for allowances, no more pretending to care about his boats." Portia clicked the device off, watching me, waiting for whatever reward she believed this particular offering had earned her. "I've been sitting on this for a long time, Wendell. Hours of it. Every plan he made to put you away and take everything that's yours. I stayed because I wanted to protect you. I wanted to wait for the right moment to show you exactly who he really is. You recorded your own husband for 6 months, I said quietly. You sat across a dinner table from him and watched him plan to have his own father institutionalized, and you said nothing. You didn't call me. You didn't warn me. You collected evidence. I was protecting myself, she said, an edge creeping into her voice now. In the world Trevor was building, there was no room for anyone but him. I did what I had to do to survive. No, I said, stepping toward her, until she had to look up to hold my eye. You did what you had to do to make certain you'd be standing on the winning side, whichever side that turned out to be. You're not a victim here, Portia. You're an accomplice who's decided to turn on him now that the payout looks better elsewhere. I reached out and took the device from her hand. She let it go willingly, a hopeful, disturbing smile already forming. So I can stay, she said. It wasn't quite a question. We can work together. I can help you clean up whatever mess he's made of things. I looked at her a long moment, seeing underneath the same careful architecture of charm she'd worn all evening, precisely the same rot that had consumed my son, dressed in a considerably better disguise, which only made it more dangerous, not less. Thank you for the gift, I said finally. It will be useful. But you've made a mistake tonight thinking that betraying him would prove your loyalty to me. All you've actually proven is that you're the kind of creature that bites whoever happens to be holding the bag of gold. I've spent 30 years keeping snakes out of this house, Portia. I'm not about to let one in through the library door. Her face contorted, the last of the mask finally falling away entirely. You'll regret this, she said, all melody gone from her voice now. You'll be a lonely old man in a house of glass, and you'll have no one left to blame but yourself. I would rather be alone in a house of glass, I said, than spend one more minute in a house of mirrors with someone like you. The door's behind you. She stormed past me, heels clicking a sharp, furious rhythm against the stone floor. The scent of her perfume trailing after her like the last argument of a woman who had never once in her entire life considered that she might lose. I stood there a moment, in the returning quiet, the recording device heavy and cold in my hand, listening to the fire settle lower in the grate, and beneath it, faint the sound of the tide against the rocks below, patient and indifferent to every single thing that had just happened in this room. I set the device down on the desk, beside the old hull drawings I had not yet found the courage to bring with me from the shed. And for a long moment I simply stood there, letting the silence do what silence does best, which is nothing at all and everything, depending on how long a man is willing to sit inside it. By the time I returned to the gallery, Estelle had already taken up position beside the media console, her fingers poised over the interface with the particular stillness of a woman who understood exactly what she was about to detonate. The 80-inch display on the mahogany wall, the one I usually reserved for hull renderings and weather models, sat dark, waiting. The feed's ready, Wendell, she said quietly, her eyes flicking toward the tablet in her other hand. I've synced the villa's network to a private streaming platform and pushed the link to every board I sit, on Bar Harbor to Newport. We're at 900 viewers already, climbing fast. I nodded, feeling the particular cold clarity that had carried me through most of the evening settle over me once more. I was no longer simply a father standing in his own gallery. I had become the curator of something considerably larger. A public reckoning that had been 30 years in the making and would, by the time it finished, belong to considerably more people than the two of us. Trevor stood near the fireplace, still arguing with the empty air, his voice raw now, scraped down to something closer to genuine panic than performance. He had not yet noticed the screen behind him coming to life. Estelle pressed the sequence, and the display flickered on, split into 3 windows across its width. The first played the voicemail from that morning, the one that had started all of it. Trevor's recorded voice filling the gallery with the same jagged, condescending edge I had heard through my phone 11 hours earlier. Spending Christmas with a washed-up old man in a boat shed is a stain on my name, Dad. The sound system carried it clean and merciless into every corner of the room. Trevor spun toward the screen, his face draining of what little color remained in it. The second window showed grainy footage from the dock that afternoon, Trevor on his knees clutching at Braxton's flight suit, begging for time on a debt he could not pay. The humiliation captured in full, unforgiving high definition. The third window was the comment feed scrolling in real time, and the people writing in it were not strangers. They were his own circle, the peers and rivals he had spent years trying to impress with money that had never once been his to spend. Is that actually Trevor Vance? I thought his father owned half the boatyards in Maine. Explains why he's been dodging the club dues since spring. So the Merrick connection really was fake. Wow. Estelle wasn't finished. She opened a fourth window, and the gallery fell into a silence heavier than anything that had come before it, because the audio now filling the room was Portia's recording, the one she had handed me not 20 minutes earlier in the library. Trevor's own voice discussing my institutionalization with the calm, clinical ease of a man closing a business deal. Just get the old man in the ward, and this villa will be ours.
"Shut it off!" Trevor screamed, his voice cracking like glass underfoot. "Shut it off right now, Dad! You're destroying my life! You're slandering me in front of everyone I know!"
I'm not slandering you, Trevor, I said, standing calm beside the console. I'm simply providing an accurate account of your character. You wanted the world to see your standing tonight. Here it is. He looked around the room, at Roscoe, at Estelle, at the guests who had gathered near the dining table, all of them watching him now, with the particular stillness of people witnessing something they would each in their own way describe for years afterward. Silas stood near the mantel arms, folded, his expression unreadable in the way it always was when he was cataloging something for later, rather than reacting to it in the moment. Dottie had reappeared in the doorway at some point during the second window, her face carrying no satisfaction at all, only the tired, settled look of a woman who had finally watched a case she'd been building for years reach its verdict. He found no sympathy anywhere in that circle, only the cold, reflected light of his own undoing. Something in him finally broke. He let out a raw, guttural sound and lunged toward the console, hands outstretched, as though he might physically choke the images off the screen if he could only reach them fast enough. He was a blur of designer wool and desperate violence, aiming for the glass itself. And he never made it. Two of Roscoe's dockhands, men built for hauling anchor chain and steadying panicked passengers on rough water, intercepted him mid-stride and pinned his arms behind his back with an ease that made him gasp for breath, his feet dangling inches above the floor. "Get him out of my sight," I said, my voice never rising. They dragged him toward the foyer, still thrashing, still screaming something about slander and lies that no longer carried any weight in a room that had already reached its own quiet verdict. The screen behind me continued to scroll comments, still arriving, strangers and acquaintances alike, watching the exact moment my son lost everything he had spent his whole life pretending to already possess. I signaled to Estelle and she ended the feed. The screen went dark, but I understood watching Trevor disappear through the foyer doors that whatever damage had just been done here tonight was not the kind that could ever be undone with an apology or a lawyer or a well-timed donation to the right charity. The gallery remained quiet a moment longer, the fire cracking softly in the grate, the guests slowly beginning to exhale the particular collective release of people who had just watched a very long story finally arrive at its true ending. Even if none of them yet understood, there was still more of it left to come waiting just beyond the water, in the shape of an engine no one in the room had invited, but everyone in some quiet way had been expecting for hours. I stood alone by the console for a moment, looking at the blank screen at my own faint reflection in the glass, and found, to my quiet surprise, that I felt nothing close to triumph. Only the specific, hollow stillness of a man who has just finished demolishing something he spent 30 years building, without ever quite meaning to build it the way a man might stand in the wreckage of a structure he'd designed himself, and still be surprised somehow at exactly how much it hurt to watch it fall. Outside, beyond the glass walls, I could already hear the low, mechanical thrum of an engine approaching across the water. Still distant, still faint, but unmistakably real, cutting steadily closer through the cold Maine dark toward the private dock below, carrying with it the part of tonight that no amount of money or careful staging would ever be able to undo. delay, or quietly buy back. Estelle found me a few minutes later, standing near the cold hearth in the emptied gallery, and waited until the last of the guests had drifted toward the terrace before she spoke. "There's something else you should know before we go outside," she said, her voice pitched low, professional, the tone she used for information that mattered considerably more than its volume suggested. "I didn't just stream tonight to my usual circle. I pushed the feed to every yacht club board I sit on. Bar Harbor, Northeast Harbor, Camden, all the way down to Newport. How many people exactly? By now, several thousand and climbing. But it's not the number that matters, Wendell. It's who's on it." She turned the tablet toward me, scrolling through a list of names I recognized instantly. Men and women who had spent decades deciding quietly and without ever announcing it who belonged inside the world Trevor had spent his entire adult life trying to force his way into. Every membership committee from here to Rhode Island just watched your son on that screen. Every one of them heard exactly what he thinks of the people who actually build things for a living. I recognized several of the names myself. Harbor masters and committee chairs I had done business with over the decades without ever once mentioning Trevor's name to them. The same way I had kept most of my life quietly compartmentalized from the rest of it. Seeing their names now attached to a feed that had just broadcast my son's complete unraveling made the evening feel considerably more permanent than it had 10 minutes earlier. I stood with that for a moment, feeling the particular weight of it settle differently than the earlier revelations had. The gambling debt was a number. The Merrick fraud was someone else's failure. This was different. This was a door closing quietly and permanently on every single room Trevor had ever wanted to stand inside. "He won't just lose tonight," Estelle said. "He'll lose every application, every sponsorship, every introduction he might have hoped to call in for the rest of his life. Word travels fast in small harbors, Wendell. It travels faster than any tide I've ever tracked, and it never quite forgets where it started." "That wasn't part of the plan," I said quietly. "No," she agreed. "It was better than the plan. The plan was punishment for tonight. This is a door that stays shut for good." I did not answer her right away. There was something in the scale of it that unsettled me in a way none of the evening's earlier confrontations had. A permanence I had not fully accounted for when I first sat down with Dottie 3 weeks ago and began sketching out exactly how this Christmas Eve was going to end. I had wanted my son to face consequences. I had not entirely reckoned with what it would feel like to watch those consequences extend so far beyond the walls of my own house into a future I would have no further hand in shaping, spreading outward across harbors and clubhouses I had never once set foot in myself. Carried by people who would remember only the shape of Trevor's disgrace and none of the 30 years that had led up to it. "Are you having second thoughts?" Estelle asked, watching my face with the particular sharpness she brought to reading any room. The same sharpness that had made her career, and more than once tonight, made my own evening considerably more effective than it might otherwise have been. "No," I said, and found saying it aloud that it was true. "I'm simply understanding for the first time tonight exactly how large a thing I set in motion 3 weeks ago. It's easier to plan a demolition on paper than it is to stand in the dust once the walls actually come down. No matter how many times you've told yourself you were ready for it." She said nothing to that, which was, in its own way, its own kind of answer. Outside, through the tall windows facing the water, I could see the lights of the approaching Marine patrol vessel, growing steadily larger against the dark, cutting a clean, deliberate line toward my private dock. The beam of its running lights, sweeping once across the surface of the cove before settling into a steady approach. The evening had reached the point where it no longer belonged entirely to me, where the machinery I had set in motion would finish the rest of the work on its own, according to a schedule I had helped arrange, but could no longer fully control whatever came of it now, largely out of my hands for the first time all night. I set my glass down on the mantel untouched, and turned to gather my coat from where I had left it near the door. "Come outside with me," I said to Estelle. "There's one more thing I need to show him before the boat arrives, and I'd rather not do it without a witness who understands exactly what it costs." She fell into step beside me without asking what I meant, the same way Roscoe and Dottie and Silas had followed me through every turn of this long night, without needing an explanation first. Each of them trusting in their own particular way that whatever I was about to do next had already been thought through more carefully than anyone watching from the outside could have guessed, even if none of us could yet say exactly how the rest of the night was going to end. We stepped out through the terrace doors together into air that had turned sharp and salt-heavy with the coming tide, and I could hear Trevor's voice somewhere ahead of us, on the path still protesting, still pleading with guards who had long since stopped listening, his words carrying out over the dark water toward a boat that was going to arrive, whether he was ready for it or not. The gravel path down to the water had iced over slightly since the guests first arrived, and I found myself walking more carefully than I usually did, aware, in a way I hadn't been an hour earlier, of exactly how old my own knees had become over the course of one very long evening. Estelle matched my pace without comment, her heels finding sure footing on the frozen stone with a practiced ease that suggested she had walked plenty of docks in far worse weather than this. I walked toward the sound of him, Estelle a half step behind me, and toward the small wooden dock at the edge of the property, where a single sail, weathered and patched from decades of use, had already been raised and rigged to catch the last of the evening light, for a purpose that had nothing to do with sailing anywhere at all. Trevor stood at the end of the dock between two of Roscoe's men, his breath coming in ragged clouds against the cold, his eyes finding mine the moment I stepped onto the planking, with Estelle beside me. Behind him, the guests who had followed us out onto the terrace arranged themselves along the railing in a loose semicircle, the same instinctive formation people fall into when they sense correctly that they are about to witness something they will be asked to describe for years afterward. "Dad, please, whatever this is, we can talk about it. Just the two of us." I did not answer him directly. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my coat and withdrew a small projector remote, the same model I had once used to review structural renderings with clients, who trusted me with fortunes considerably smaller than the one I was about to discuss now. I pressed the button, and the old sail rigged at the end of the dock, weathered canvas that had crossed open water more times than I could count, caught the beam of light, and became for the next several minutes the largest and coldest legal document my son would ever read. The Wendell R. Ashby Revocable Living Trust, notarized and updated as of 4 o'clock this afternoon. The text scrolled slowly upward, glowing pale against the dark canvas, and the guests who had followed us out onto the terrace fell into a silence heavier than any I had heard from them all evening. Even the wind seemed to quiet itself briefly, as though the whole cove had decided to lean in and listen, along with the rest of us. "This document," I said, my voice carrying clean across the water, "details the full disposition of my estate upon my death. The shed, the workshop equipment, the investment accounts I've built quietly over 4 decades. And this island Trevor, along with every structure on it down to the last piling I ever drove into this ledge myself." I let the text hold a moment before continuing. "To the Ashby Maritime Trust, a foundation established this spring, I bequeath 99.9% of my total assets. It will fund apprenticeships for young shipwrights who understand that a trade is built with your hands over years, not inherited in an afternoon. The same lesson I spent 30 years hoping someone might eventually teach you one way or another." Trevor's eyes stayed fixed on the sail, his mouth working soundlessly, watching a fortune he had believed on some level was already his slip away, line by line, into an institution that would never once thank him for it, never once send him a card at Christmas, never once ask him to justify a single dollar of it. "And to my son," I said, pressing the remote a final time. "Trevor Ashby, I bequeath the sum of exactly $1. The number appeared enormous against the canvas. A single glowing figure that seemed to hang over the black water like something too large for the small sail carrying it. The silence that followed was total, broken only by the slow, patient sound of waves against the pilings beneath us. Somewhere out on the dark water, a buoy bell rang once, faint and far off. The kind of sound that carries for miles across cold water and means nothing at all beyond marking a channel. No one on that dock had any intention of navigating tonight. $1, Trevor, I said, turning to look at him directly. In the legal world, That number carries a very specific meaning. It isn't an oversight. It proves I haven't forgotten you. It proves this was a deliberate choice made with a complete understanding of exactly who you've become, not a mistake made in anger or an accident of paperwork some clerk will quietly correct next week.
"You can't do this," he whispered, though the words had no force left behind them. No weight at all against the light, still glowing over both our heads.
"I can and I have," I said. "That dollar is enough to buy a bus ticket back to the mainland from the ferry terminal. Consider it starting capital for a life where you finally learn what it costs to earn one, rather than simply asking for it and waiting for the deposit to clear." Trevor's knees seemed to give slightly, one of the guards steadying him without being asked. And for a moment he said nothing at all, simply staring at the number still burning against the sail. The wind catching the canvas and making the glowing digit ripple and shudder, as though even the fabric itself couldn't quite hold steady under the weight of it. The way nothing that night seemed able to hold entirely still once it came within range of that particular light. The wind picked up off the water, and the sail rippled once more, sending the projected numbers shivering across its surface, before settling flat again. Somewhere behind us, I heard Estelle exhale a small, quiet sound I doubted she meant for anyone to notice. No one on the dock spoke. No one moved to comfort him. The only sound was the water lapping steadily against the pilings, and the distant growing thrum of the marine patrol boat drawing closer through the dark, its running lights now visible as two small, steady points cutting through the black. When Trevor finally spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of the fury that had carried him through the rest of the night, replaced by something smaller, something I had not heard from him since he was a boy, small enough to still believe his father hung the moon over this exact stretch of water. "I thought," he said so quietly I nearly lost it beneath the sound of the tide, "you didn't remember me anymore, that I'd just become a name on a card statement to you." I looked at him for a long moment, the projected numbers still glowing faintly on the sail behind him, and found, to my own considerable surprise, that I did not have an answer ready for that particular sentence, not one that felt true enough to say out loud in front of everyone still gathered on the dock. I had spent 3 weeks preparing for every version of tonight I could imagine, every angle of his anger, every possible attempt at manipulation, and I had somehow failed to prepare for the one sentence that might have actually reached me. The Marine patrol boat's engine grew steadily louder behind us, cutting through the quiet. And I understood, standing there, with the answer still unformed somewhere behind my ribs, that whatever I might have said to him in that moment was about to be interrupted by considerably more official business, whether either of us was ready for it or not. "Give us a moment," I said to the officers, now waiting at the edge of the dock, my voice steadier than I felt. 2 minutes. That's all I'm asking." The lead officer glanced at Dottie, who nodded once and stepped back toward the boat without argument. Behind them, the guests had gone quiet, sensing correctly that whatever came next belonged to a smaller audience than the one currently standing on my dock. I turned and walked toward the small workshop at the end of the property, the one I kept separate from the main house, close enough to hear the water, but far enough to think in peace. The one Trevor had visited perhaps a dozen times in his entire life and never once asked a single question about. Trevor followed, without being told to, some old instinct from childhood, still intact beneath everything the night had stripped away from him. His footsteps unsteady on the frozen path. Inside, the space smelled of linseed oil and cold sawdust, lit by a single bulb hanging from a cord I had strung myself sometime in the early 90s, and never bothered to replace with anything more permanent. And there, suspended from the rafters on the same worn ropes it had hung from for 27 years, was the small, unfinished hull, half-planked, half-forgotten, exactly as it had been the last time either of us had looked at it together. Trevor stopped in the doorway, staring up at it, his breath still ragged from the cold outside, his eyes adjusting slowly to the dim, single bulb after the brightness of the gallery, and the harsh white beam of the projector still burning somewhere behind us on the dock. "You still have that thing." "I never let myself get rid of it," I said. "We started it together, you and I,
When you were 8 years old, you held the plane while I guided your hands along the grain, and you complained the whole time that your fingers hurt, and I told you that was how you knew you were building something real. We got as far as the third rib before your mother got sick.
Something shifted in Trevor's face, a memory surfacing he had clearly buried a long time ago. Deliberately, the way a person buries the memories that hurt the most, precisely because they were once the happiest.
After she died, I said, I put it up there. And I told myself I'd finish it once things settled. Things never settled, Trevor. I just got better at pretending the boat wasn't still hanging there, waiting on both of us to come back to it.
What does this have to do with tonight? His voice had lost its earlier fury entirely now, replaced by something rawer, more exposed. A boy standing in a cold room asking a question he was no longer certain he wanted answered. His eyes still fixed on the hull rather than on me, as though it might be easier to hear whatever came next without having to watch my face while I said it. I walked to the workbench and opened the drawer I had not opened in front of another living soul in over 2 decades. Pulling out a single folded document, older and softer at the creases than any of the paperwork Dottie had produced that evening.
Your mother left a trust in your name before she died, I said.
Small at the time, modest, meant to help you start a life once you were ready for one. I was the only signature required to release it, and only I ever knew that signature was still outstanding.
Trevor went very still.
27 years, he said, disbelief thinning his voice to almost nothing. You've had money from Mom this whole time and I never knew it existed? All those years I asked you for help with tuition, with the deposit on my first apartment, you just watched me struggle?
I did, I said, and did not try to soften it.
I told myself it was protection, yours and mine. If I never gave you anything freely, I could never be disappointed in how you used it. If I never trusted you with it, I could never find out I'd been right to be afraid. And some cowardly part of me preferred not knowing to finding out for certain.
I made myself hold his eyes, though it cost me more than anything else had that night. More than the debt, more than the will, more than the number I had projected onto a sail an hour earlier for an audience of strangers. Tonight I understood something standing on that dock, Trevor. When you asked me if I'd forgotten you existed. I wasn't only testing whether you deserved love, I was punishing a boy for never once being taught how to receive it without a condition attached. And I was the one who never taught him. That failure was never entirely yours to carry alone. I let it become the whole shape of you. And then I stood back and judged the shape. Trevor did not answer right away. He looked up at the hull instead, at the small, unfinished ribs still exposed beneath a quarter-century of dust. And something in his shoulders came undone that had nothing to do with anger. A kind of collapsing that looked, for the first time all night, entirely without performance. I reached up and rested my hand against the curve of the hull, feeling the old wood beneath my palm, worn smooth in places from 30 years of my own hands returning to it without ever quite finishing the work. I found I had nothing further to say. Some truths once spoken do not require anything more added to them. Trevor stepped closer slowly and reached up beside me, his fingers finding the same curve of wood a few inches from mine. The two of us standing beneath the single hanging bulb in a silence that held nothing sharp in it at all, only the small creak of old rope settling under the boat's negligible weight, the distant hum of the space heater in the corner, a scrap of sawdust drifting down from somewhere above and catching the light on its way to the floor. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us needed to. For the first time since he had stepped off the seaplane that afternoon, my son was simply standing still, touching something that had once belonged to both of us, before either of us had learned how to ruin it. Outside, faint at first, and then unmistakable. The low blast of the Marine Patrol's horn carried across the water, calling an end to whatever time we had left, standing there together in the cold. The sound arriving exactly the way most important things had arrived that night, on someone else's schedule, whether either of us was finished with the moment or not. We walked back out into the cold together, side by side, neither of us speaking, the workshop door swinging shut behind us on its old hinge.
The path back to the dock felt shorter than it had on the way in, the way distances always seem to shrink once whatever needed to happen along them has already happened. The Marine patrol boat had tied off at the dock, its running lights washing the planking in alternating red and blue, and the two officers stood waiting beside Dottie Patient, in the particular way of men who had done this exact job in far worse weather than this. The guests had drifted back a respectful distance, watching from the terrace rail, their earlier fascination with the evening spectacle now tempered by something closer to genuine discomfort at witnessing the actual end of it. Trevor's steps slowed as we came within sight of them, some last flicker of resistance surfacing before it finally gave out entirely. His shoulders dropping in the particular way of a man who has stopped bracing for a blow he now understands is unavoidable. "Mr. Ashby," the lead officer said, stepping forward with a tablet already in hand. "Trevor Ashby." "That's me," Trevor said, his voice smaller than it had been at any point that night. "We have a warrant here for your arrest, sir. Attempted extortion and making written threats of institutionalization against a family member filed by Dorothea Ashby 3 days ago, supported by documented evidence submitted this evening." Trevor turned to look at Dottie, who met his eyes without flinching. "You filed this 3 days ago," he said, "before any of tonight even happened." "I filed it the moment I had enough to make it stick," Dottie said, her voice even professional, though I caught the smallest tremor beneath it that told me this particular filing had cost her something too. Tonight simply gave the court everything else it needed to move quickly. The officer produced a set of handcuffs, and Trevor did not resist, as his hands were drawn behind his back, the metal closing with a small, final click that seemed to carry farther across the water than it should have. "Wait," Trevor said, twisting to look back at me one last time as the officers began walking him toward the boat. "Dad, wait." I stepped forward close enough that only he could hear me over the low idle of the boat's engine. "I heard you tonight," I said quietly. "In the workshop. I meant every word of it. That doesn't undo what happens from here, Trevor. But it isn't nothing either." "I know," he said, and for the first time all night, I believed him completely. The officers guided him down onto the deck of the patrol boat, where Portia already sat huddled beneath a gray wool blanket, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, her earlier confidence entirely gone. Her carefully arranged hair now flattened and windblown. The last traces of the woman who had swept off that seaplane hours earlier, chasing an inheritance nowhere to be found. She had been picked up from the terrace 20 minutes earlier, on a separate matter Dottie had not yet fully explained to me. Something involving the recording device and a conspiracy charge Evelyn had assembled with characteristic thoroughness once the evidence found its way into the right hands. Trevor did not look at her as he was seated beside her on the bench. She did not look at him either. The engines rumbled to life, churning the black water at the stern into pale foam. "Dad!" Trevor called out one final time as the boat began to pull away from the dock, his voice carrying thin and desperate across the widening gap of water. "The pilot! What about the pilot? He's still holding my luggage. He's demanding money I don't have." The officers did not stop the boat. They did not even glance back toward the dock where Praxton still stood dark and unmoving beside the seaplane, waiting for a transport of his own that Trevor knew nothing about yet. I watched the boat's lights shrink slowly into the distance, the sound of its engine fading into the steady murmur of the tide, until there was nothing left on the water but darkness and the faint rhythmic slap of waves against the pilings, and somewhere far off, the low, mournful call of a buoy bell marking a channel none of us had any further reason to navigate tonight. Dottie came to stand beside me, her hand finding my shoulder. The gesture more comfort than either of us had allowed ourselves all evening. Up close, I could see the toll the night had taken on her too. The careful composure she had worn since 8 o'clock that morning finally beginning to show its seams. "It's done, Wendell," she said. "The loop's closed." "Not entirely," I said, looking past her toward the far end of the dock, where Praxton remained exactly where he'd been standing for hours. Patient as a man who understood that some debts simply took longer to collect than others. The law's taken him for tonight, but Praxton and the charter company still have $22,000 outstanding, and I imagine they intend to collect it their own way, on their own schedule. Dottie followed my gaze. understanding settling over her features slowly, then all at once.
You planned that too.
I planned very little of tonight, down to the last detail, I said. But I made certain the people I trust were standing exactly where they needed to be, and I let the rest sort itself out according to its own logic. I've found that works considerably better than trying to control every variable myself. It certainly worked better tonight than 30 years of trying to control Trevor ever did.
She let out a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh and squeezed my shoulder once before letting her hand fall away. Come inside. It's cold and there are still guests who will want to say goodnight before they head back across the water themselves.
In a moment, I said. I'd like to stand out here a little longer first. She studied me for a beat, the same careful reading she'd been doing all night, and then nodded and turned back toward the house without another word, leaving me alone at the edge of the dock, with the sound of the tide and the fading hum of an engine already too distant to hear clearly anymore. The wind shifted off the water, carrying with it the first hint of the coming morning's cold. And somewhere behind us, back in the workshop, the small, unfinished hull hung exactly where it always had, waiting, as it always had, for someone to finally decide what came next. By 6 the next morning, the first pale light of Christmas Day had begun to climb over the water, thin and gray. The kind of dawn that arrives in Maine more as a suggestion than an announcement. The house behind me was quiet, most of the guests still asleep in the rooms I had prepared for them the week before, never once mentioning to any of them that I expected the evening to end quite this way. I stood on the upper deck of the main house with a pair of binoculars I had not used in years, watching the mainland dock across the channel where a court-appointed labor crew had already begun their morning shift. Dottie had explained the arrangement to me the night before, once the adrenaline of the arrest had finally worn off enough for either of us to talk through logistics. Rather than sit idle awaiting trial, Trevor had been assigned to a restorative labor program funded in part, though he did not yet know it, by a foundation that carried my late wife's name, a detail I had asked Dottie to arrange, without ever quite explaining why it mattered to me as much as it did. I found him through the lens after a moment of searching. A small figure in a bright orange vest against the gray concrete of the public pier. Unmistakable even at this distance, by the particular stiffness in his posture. A man clearly unaccustomed to work that required his hands to do anything other than sign for things. He was sweeping. The broom looked heavy and unfamiliar in his grip. The same hands that had once gripped nothing heavier than a car key or a cocktail glass, now dragging a splintered wooden handle across salt-crusted concrete, clearing debris that had built up around the piling since the last storm. A fisherman walked past him, carrying a bucket of bait, glancing at Trevor with the brief, incurious attention people reserve for anyone doing an unremarkable job on an ordinary morning, not even slowing his stride, entirely unaware that he had just walked past a man who 24 hours earlier had believed himself the heir to an island fortune. Had believed, in fact, that fortunes of that size were owed to men of his particular bloodline, simply for existing. There was no Commodore to rescue him from the cold this morning. No gold-plated anything waiting to whisk him off to somewhere warmer. No card authorized or otherwise that could buy his way out of a single hour of this particular sentence. There was only the broom and the wind and a supervisor standing nearby with a clipboard, entirely unimpressed by whatever name Trevor might once have tried to invoke in a room like the one he'd stood in last night. I watched him struggle to lift a bag of collected debris toward the waste containers at the end of the pier, his shoulders straining under a weight that would have been unremarkable to any of the fishermen working the boats nearby, but was for Trevor an entirely foreign kind of labor. He stumbled once, the bag slipping, and had to set it down and start the lift over again, his breath visible in short, frustrated clouds against the cold. I lowered the binoculars for a moment, feeling something complicated settle in my chest. Not quite satisfaction, not quite regret. Something closer to the particular ache of watching a structure you designed finally being tested under a load you always suspected it might not be able to bear. And finding now that the test had actually arrived that you had hoped quietly and against your own better judgment that it might hold anyway. I raised the binoculars again in time to see him drop the bag entirely, doubling over, hands braced against his knees, chest heaving. The supervisor said something I couldn't hear from this distance, and Trevor straightened, wiped his face with the back of one gloved hand, and bent to try again. This time managing to hoist the bag onto his shoulder and stagger the remaining distance to the waste container without dropping it a second time. This was the education I should have given him decades ago, I thought. Not the shed, not the trust I kept sealed, not even the truth I had finally spoken last night in the workshop. This, the simple, unglamorous understanding that everything in this world costs something, and that dignity is built through the sweat of your own effort, rather than the contents of someone else's account. I had tried for 30 years to teach him that lesson through a slowly widening distance I told myself was principle rather than what it more honestly resembled, which was fear. It had taken a court order and a broom to finally teach him what I never once managed to, and I could not decide standing there in the cold whether that made me a wiser man or simply a slower one. He was no longer a knight waiting to inherit a castle. He was a man in an orange vest, learning one aching hour at a time exactly what his father's shed had actually cost to build, and what it might yet cost him to build anything of his own. A lesson no inheritance, however large or however withheld, could ever have taught him nearly as well as one cold Christmas morning, with a broom in his hands. I stood there a long while, watching the small orange figure grow steadily more exhausted against the gray backdrop of the pier, until the cold finally worked its way through my coat, and I understood I had seen enough for one morning. There would be other mornings to watch if he let there be, and other lessons still ahead of him that had nothing to do with brooms or debt or any ledger I could balance on his behalf. I lowered the binoculars a final time and turned away from the rail, walking back toward the warmth of the house, my footsteps sounding hollow and strange on the frost-covered deck. The ledger of 30 years finally, if only partially, beginning to balance itself. Though I understood, even as I walked, that some accounts take considerably longer than a single Christmas morning to settle in full, and that this one might never entirely close. Behind me, across the water, my sun kept sweeping small and orange and unglamorous against the gray Maine morning, doing the only kind of work either to us had left available to prove anything at all. By 6 the next morning, the first pale light of Christmas Day had begun to climb over the water, thin and gray, the kind of dawn that arrives in Maine more as a suggestion than an announcement. The house behind me was quiet, most of the guests still asleep in the rooms I had prepared for them the week before, never once mentioning to any of them that I expected the evening to end quite this way. I stood on the upper deck of the main house with a pair of binoculars I had not used in years, watching the mainland dock across the channel where a court-appointed labor crew had already begun their morning shift. Dottie had explained the arrangement to me the night before, once the adrenaline of the arrest had finally worn off enough for either of us to talk through logistics. Rather than sit idle awaiting trial, Trevor had been assigned to a restorative labor program, funded in part, though he did not yet know it, by a foundation that carried my late wife's name, a detail I had asked Dottie to arrange without ever quite explaining why it mattered to me as much as it did. I found him through the lens after a moment of searching, a small figure in a bright orange vest against the gray concrete of the public pier unmistakable, even at this distance by the particular stiffness in his posture. A man clearly unaccustomed to work that required his hands to do anything at all other than sign for things or count them. He was sweeping. The broom looked heavy and unfamiliar in his grip, the same hands that had once gripped nothing heavier than a car key or a cocktail glass, now dragging a splintered wooden handle across salt-crusted concrete, clearing debris that had built up around the piling since the last storm. A fisherman walked past him, carrying a bucket of bait, glancing at Trevor with the brief, incurious attention people reserve for anyone doing an unremarkable job on an ordinary morning, not even slowing his stride. Entirely unaware that he had just walked past a man who 24 hours earlier had believed himself the heir to an island fortune, had believed, in fact, that fortunes of that size were owed to men of his particular bloodline simply for existing. There was no Commodore to rescue him from the cold this morning. No gold-plated anything waiting to whisk him off to somewhere warmer. No card authorized or otherwise that could buy his way out of a single hour of this particular sentence. There was only the broom and the wind
and a supervisor standing nearby with a clipboard entirely unimpressed by whatever name Trevor might once have tried to invoke in a room like the one he'd stood in last night. Somewhere behind him, a small fishing trawler idled at its mooring, its crew already 3 hours into their own morning, entirely indifferent to the small drama unfolding on the concrete beside them. I watched him struggle to lift a bag of collected debris toward the waste containers at the end of the pier, his shoulders straining under a weight that would have been unremarkable to any of the fishermen working the boats nearby, but was for Trevor an entirely foreign kind of labor. He stumbled once, the bag slipping, and had to set it down and start the lift over again, his breath visible in short, frustrated clouds against the cold. I lowered the binoculars for a moment, feeling something complicated settle in my chest. Not quite satisfaction, not quite regret, something closer to the particular ache of watching a structure you designed finally being tested under a load you always suspected it might not be able to bear. And finding now that the test had actually arrived, that you had hoped quietly, and against your own better judgment, that it might hold anyway. I raised the binoculars again in time to see him drop the bag entirely. Doubling over, hands braced against his knees, chest heaving. The supervisor said something I couldn't hear from this distance, and Trevor straightened, wiped his face with the back of one gloved hand, and bent to try again. This time managing to hoist the bag onto his shoulder and stagger the remaining distance to the waste container without dropping it a second time. This was the education I should have given him decades ago, I thought. Not the shed, not the trust I kept sealed, not even the truth I had finally spoken last night in the workshop. This. The simple, unglamorous understanding that everything in this world costs something, and that dignity is built through the sweat of your own effort, rather than the contents of someone else's account. I had tried for 30 years to teach him that lesson through withholding it through a slowly widening distance I told myself was principle, rather than what it more honestly resembled, which was fear. It had taken a court order and a broom to finally teach him what I never once managed to. And I could not decide, standing there in the cold, whether that made me a wiser man or simply a slower one. He was no longer a knight waiting to inherit a castle. He was a man in an orange vest, learning one aching hour at a time exactly what his father's shed had actually cost to build and what it might yet cost him to build anything of his own. A lesson no inheritance, however large or however withheld, could ever have taught him nearly as well as one cold Christmas morning with a broom in his hands. I stood there a long while, watching the small, orange figure grow steadily more exhausted against the gray backdrop of the pier, until the cold finally worked its way through my coat, and I understood I had seen enough for one morning. There would be other mornings to watch if he let there be, and other lessons still ahead of him that had nothing to do with brooms or debt or any ledger I could balance on his behalf. I lowered the binoculars a final time and turned away from the rail, walking back toward the warmth of the house, my footsteps sounding hollow and strange on the frost-covered deck. The ledger of 30 years finally, if only partially, beginning to balance itself. Though I understood, even as I walked, that some accounts take considerably longer than a single Christmas morning to settle in full, and that this one might never entirely close. Behind me across the water, my sun kept sweeping small and orange and unglamorous against the gray Maine morning, doing the only kind of work either of us had left available to prove anything at all. One slow, deliberate stroke of the broom at a time, with no one left watching him now except a father who had finally stopped needing to see him fail in order to understand what he had actually cost them both. By mid-morning, most of the guests had gathered in the great room for a late breakfast. The low murmur of conversation and the clink of coffee cups drifting faintly down the hallway toward the workshop, where I had retreated once I could no longer stand at the rail with the binoculars any longer. The house smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and faintly of the pine garland still strung along the mantel from the night before, as though the building itself had not yet caught up with everything that had happened inside it. I sat on the old stool beside the workbench, the same stool I had sat on the day Trevor and I started the hull together, and looked up at the small, unfinished boat hanging exactly where it always had. 27 years of dust had settled into the grain of the wood, softening its edges.
And I found myself wondering, not for the first time that morning, whether it would even be possible to finish now, or whether some structures, once interrupted long enough, simply become monuments instead, more useful standing still than they would ever be completed. Dottie found me there a while later, letting herself in without knocking, the way she had let herself into most rooms of my life since we were children, back when the only structures either of us had to worry about were sandcastles and the particular architecture of childhood grudges.
"You've been in here since sunrise," she said, settling onto an overturned crate across from me, her breath still visible in the unheated room. "The guests are asking after you. Roscoe wants to toast something, though I suspect he'd toast a change in the weather at this point, given how the night went."
"I'll be in shortly."
She studied me a moment. The particular reading she had been doing all night and into the morning. And I understood she had already guessed most of what I was sitting with before I said a word of it.
"You didn't fail him, Wendell," she said finally. "You gave him 30 years of opportunity. 30 years of chances most sons never get once, let alone repeatedly. He failed the blueprint, not you."
"I'd like to believe that," I said. "I've spent most of the last 12 hours trying to believe it. But I stood in this room with him last night and told him the truth about the trust, and do you know what struck me hardest, watching his face while I said it?"
"What?"
"That I could have told him at any point in the last 27 years. I could have called him on his 21st birthday and simply given it to him freely, the way his mother intended. I chose not to every single year, and I told myself it was wisdom. I'm no longer certain it was anything other than fear dressed up carefully enough that I stopped recognizing it as fear at all."
Dottie was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet she rarely allowed herself. More accustomed to arguing a point than sitting inside one, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving between me and the boat, as though weighing which one needed her attention more.
"Maybe it was both," she said eventually. "Wisdom and fear aren't always as separate as we'd like them to be. You were protecting something real, Wendell. You just protected it in a way that cost you both more than either of you could afford. And I don't think either of us is qualified this morning to say exactly how much."
I looked up at the hull again, at the pale wood beneath the dust, at the small gaps between the ribs where the planking had never been finished.
"I keep thinking about the question," I said.
"The one I've been circling all night without ever quite landing on an answer. If love has to pass a test before you're willing to give it, is it still love? Or is it just a transaction wearing love's clothes waiting for the right invoice to come due?"
"I don't know,"
Dottie said honestly, which was, I thought, more useful than a comforting lie would have been. "I don't think there's a clean answer to that one, Wendell. I think you find out slowly, over years, whether the thing you built was love or just very well-organized fear. Sometimes it turns out to be both, running side by side the whole time, and you only get to see which one was steering after the fact." Outside the small workshop window, I could see a sliver of the water calm, now silver under the climbing sun. The Marine patrol boat and everything it had carried away from my dock the night before, already long gone from view.
"What will you do?"
Dottie asked. "About the trust. About all of it once the legal matters settle." "I don't know that either," I said, and found saying it aloud that the not knowing didn't frighten me the way it might have a day earlier. "I'm not going to call him this morning and undo any of what happened. He needs the labor, the consequences, all of it, exactly as it's been arranged. But the trust is still there. It always was. I'm not going to pretend I've decided anything final about what happens to it now."
"That's not nothing," Dottie said, echoing, without meaning to, the very thing I had said to Trevor on the dock the night before. The coincidence of it settling over both of us for a moment, before either of us thought to remark on it.
"No," I agreed, "it isn't."
She reached over and rested her hand briefly on the curve of the hull, the same gesture Trevor had made hours earlier. And for a moment, the three of us, in some strange fashion, were all touching the same unfinished thing at once, though only two of us were in the room.
"Come have breakfast," she said, standing. "The boat isn't going anywhere. It never has."
I did not answer right away.
But I did stand finally, my knees stiff from the cold and the long night behind them, and followed my sister out of the workshop and back toward the warmth of the house, leaving the small hull swinging gently on its old ropes behind us. Dust settling once more over wood that had waited 27 years, and apparently was prepared to wait a while longer. Still patient in the particular way that only unfinished things ever really are. At the door, I glanced back once, the way I imagined most people glance back at rooms that hold more than the objects sitting inside them, and found the boat exactly where I had left it, exactly where it had always been, neither closer to finished nor any further from it than it had been that morning, or the morning before, or any of the mornings across 27 quiet years that had somehow, without my ever quite noticing, become the whole shape of my life. By the time I rejoined them, the fire in the great room had burned down to a low bed of amber coals, and the frantic energy of the night before had softened into something quieter. 4 people who had watched a very long story finally reach its ending, and were now simply glad to be sitting somewhere warm together. Roscoe stood as I entered, already reaching for a bottle of something dark and well-aged. "There he is. We were about to send Dottie back in after you." "I needed a few minutes," I said, settling into the chair nearest the fire. "You've earned considerably more than a few minutes, Wendell," Estelle said, curled into the corner of the sofa, with her tablet, finally, mercifully, nowhere in sight. "Though I imagine you'll take the minimum amount of rest you can get away with, same as always." Silas poured a measure into a glass and handed it to me, without being asked, the particular efficiency of a man who had spent a career anticipating what people needed before they thought to say it aloud. "To freedom," he said simply, raising his own glass. "To freedom," Roscoe echoed. "And to the clarity of a house finally cleared of its structural rot. If you'll forgive me borrowing your own language for it." We drank. The fire cracked once, sending a small shower of sparks up into the flue, and for a moment none of us said anything, at all content simply to sit inside the particular silence that follows a long ordeal. The kind that doesn't need filling. "I've been waiting for a night like this since Trevor's 21st birthday," Dottie said eventually, leaning back against the velvet cushions, her eyes on the coals. "I watched you build foundations for him out of gold, Wendell, and watched him pick them up and use them as a weapon against you year after year. Watching him on that patrol boat wasn't just the law doing its job, it felt like the whole world finally balancing a ledger that had been tilted for far too long." "He was never going to change on his own, Wendell," Silas added, his tone clinical as ever, but carrying underneath it something considerably warmer. "By cutting off the money, you didn't just punish him. You gave him the only real chance he's ever had to actually find something worth becoming. But more than that, you finally saved yourself from spending the rest of your life as a prisoner inside your own success." "I keep waiting to feel triumphant about it," I admitted, turning the glass slowly in my hand, watching the firelight catch the amber liquid inside it. "I don't think that particular feeling is coming. Mostly what I feel is tired, and considerably lighter than I have in years, though I couldn't tell you exactly which parts of me got lighter." "That's usually how it goes," Dottie said. "The relief arrives quietly, a few days after the anger finishes doing all the loud work. You'll feel it more once you've slept properly, which, judging by the state of you right now, hasn't happened yet." Roscoe let out a low, appreciative chuckle and gestured toward the dark window beyond which the cove sat quiet, under a sky just beginning to clear. "World's a big place, Wendell. A great deal bigger than the noise of one's spoiled air and his borrowed compass. My newest tow vessel makes her maiden run up the coast next month, all the way to the Bay of Fundy and back. I'd like you aboard for at least part of it." I thought of Marion's briefcase, still sitting on the mahogany table down the hall, of the small hull still hanging in the workshop of the trust I had neither spent nor released, and found that Roscoe's words landed somewhere I hadn't quite expected them to. "I might take you up on that eventually," I said. "Seeing a little more of the world through eyes that aren't constantly checking for a structural flaw." "We'd like that," Estelle said, and meant it. The 4 of them looking at me with an ease I had rarely allowed myself to notice, fully, until this exact moment, in this exact chair. With the fire burning low, and the worst of the night finally behind us, I looked around the room at each of them in turn. Roscoe and Estelle and Silas and Dottie, the people who actually understood the grit it had taken to build anything real. And understood, not for the first time, but perhaps for the first time with this particular clarity, that they had never once loved me for the villa, or the trust, or the prestige of a name carved into a bronze plaque somewhere on this island. They had known me when I had nothing but a drafting table and a stubborn refusal to quit, and they had simply stayed. They were my family, in every sense that mattered, bound not by blood or by the accident of shared surname, but by respect, and by decades of storms weathered side by side, and by the particular loyalty that only survives contact with a person's worst mornings as well as their best ones. The fire settled lower, and one by one my friends began drifting off toward the guest wing, leaving me alone at last with the dying coals and the distant, steady heartbeat of the ocean against the rocks below the terrace. The house finally quiet around me, for the first time since before the voicemail had ever arrived. 20 hours and an entire lifetime of reckoning ago. I found Praxton exactly where I expected to, still standing near the seaplane on the dock, though the tension that had carried him through the night had eased into the loose, patient stance of a man simply waiting out the last stretch of a long shift. "You've been out here since yesterday afternoon," I said, coming to stand beside him. "You should have come inside. There was a fire and considerably better coffee than whatever's left in that thermos of yours." "Wasn't my place," Praxton said, glancing at the empty flask beside his boot. "Man in my line of work learns early that staying visible is half the job. Besides, somebody needed to keep an eye on the aircraft. Wouldn't do to have it drift off in the tide while everyone was busy with the fireworks up at the house." I allowed myself something close to a smile. The bill, $22,000. I'd like to settle it properly, not through my son's authorized card and not through the account he tried to bleed dry either. Already flagged for direct payment from your firm, Mr. Ashby. Roscoe saw to it around midnight while you were occupied elsewhere. Praxton's mouth twitched, the closest thing to amusement I'd seen from him all night. Didn't figure you for a man who'd let a debt sit unpaid past sunrise, whoever technically incurred it. No, I agreed. I don't much care for unpaid debts on either side of the ledger. He studied me a moment, the same flat, assessing look he'd given Trevor on this exact spot the afternoon before, though it settled differently on me. Less suspicion, more simple curiosity. Your boy tried to tell the officers I was holding his luggage hostage, demanding money he didn't have. He wasn't entirely wrong about the second part. No, Praxton said. He wasn't. But that's not really what last night was about, was it? The luggage. He nodded once toward the house behind us, its windows glowing warm against the gray morning. Man doesn't rig a laser projection onto a sail just to collect on a charter fee. I did not answer that directly. There seemed little point standing on a cold dock with a man who had clearly understood the shape of the evening long before most of my own guests had. "How long have you been flying charter up this coast?" I asked instead. Curious in spite of myself, about a man who had stood at the center of my son's undoing without ever once raising his voice. 11 years, give or take. Before that, longer than I care to discuss over open water. He glanced toward the horizon where the sun had finally cleared the tree line on the mainland. You learn a few things about people doing this work. Who pays before they board, who pays after being asked twice, and who never intends to pay at all and just hopes nobody calls them on it. Your son's the third kind. Has been for a while, I'd guess, long before yesterday. You could tell that from one transaction. I could tell that from the way he talked to me before he even knew the card was declined, Praxton said. Man who respects the people doing the work doesn't talk that way to a pilot, win or lose on the payment. That part wasn't about the money at all. Roscoe speaks well of the men he trusts, I said. He doesn't extend that trust often. He's been fair to me over the years, Praxton said. That counts for something in a business full of people who aren't. That's a rare quality in this line of work, I said. Most men in your position would have made a spectacle of yesterday afternoon. Milked it for a story to tell at every marina from here to Portland. Wouldn't have been professional. He said it simply, without any performance of modesty behind it, the plain statement of a man who had built his entire reputation on precisely that kind of restraint.
Besides, wasn't my business what was between you and your son. My business was the fair. That's settled now.
I extended my hand and he shook it, his grip firm and brief. The handshake of a man who did not waste motion on anything that didn't require it.
If you're ever back through these waters, I said, the dock's open. No card required.
Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one.
Might take you up on that, Mr. Ashby. Not many people say that to me and actually mean it.
He turned toward the aircraft, running through some final check along its hull with the same unhurried thoroughness he'd shown standing guard over it through the entire long night. And I watched him for a moment longer, before turning back toward the house, the last of the evening's unfinished business, finally quietly closed. The tide had begun to shift again beneath the dock, the water pulling back from the pilings in that slow, patient rhythm it always kept indifferent to whatever business had been conducted on the boards above it, whether love or debt or the particular architecture of a family finally, however imperfectly, beginning to right itself. Somewhere behind me the sound of breakfast being cleared drifted faintly down from the house, ordinary and warm, the kind of sound that belonged to a morning entirely unremarkable in every way except for everything that had happened just before it. I did not go back to bed that morning, though every part of my body argued I should. Instead, once the last of the guests had drifted off to sleep and the house had settled into the particular hush that follows a long night, I found myself back in the workshop. This time, with a fresh sheet of drafting paper pinned to the old board, instead of the hull drawings I usually kept there. I had not drawn anything by hand in years, not since the last major renovation on the villa itself, and my fingers felt stiff and uncertain around the pencil at first, the way any tool feels after a long absence, waiting to remember the shape of the hand that once knew it well. I did not draw a building. I drew a question instead, roughly in the corner of the page. The same one I had spoken aloud to Dottie a few hours earlier. If love requires a test, is it still love? I looked at it for a long moment, then began sketching around it, the way I had once sketched around a client's impossible request, until the actual buildable answer slowly revealed itself. What emerged an hour later was the outline of a modest campus, low buildings, arranged around a working boatyard slips for a dozen small craft. A covered workshop considerably larger than my own, but built along the same principles. Natural light, good ventilation, room enough for a person to make mistakes without an audience watching too closely. I labeled it, tentatively, the Marion Ashby School for Maritime Craft. Then crossed out school and wrote apprenticeship instead. Then crossed that out too and simply left the name unfinished at the bottom of the page, the way the small hull above me had sat unfinished for 27 years, waiting for the right ending to present itself, rather than forcing one prematurely. The idea had been circling somewhere in the back of my mind since long before last night, since the trust itself had first been established, though I had never let myself put pencil to paper on it. The same way I had never let myself finish the boat. The same way I had never let myself simply tell Trevor the truth without first extracting some proof he deserved to hear it. I understood now, looking at the rough shape taking form under my hand, that all three of those unfinished things had likely been the same unfinished thing, wearing different disguises, waiting patiently in different corners of my life for me to finally run out of reasons to keep them that way. This would not be a monument to my own success, the way the villa sometimes felt on its more self-important days, all glass and angles and carefully curated silence. It would be a place where young people who had nothing but a stubborn refusal to quit the same inheritance I had started with myself could learn a trade with their hands, properly, patiently, without anyone standing over them keeping score of whether they'd earned the privilege first. I thought of Trevor sweeping a public dock 40 minutes away, and found I did not yet know whether he would ever walk through the doors of a place like this. Whether he would want to, whether I would even offer. That question, unlike the shape of the buildings themselves, was not one I could sketch my way toward an answer for. Some blueprints simply had to wait for their foundation to finish settling before you could trust what you built on top of it. I set the pencil down and looked at the drawing a while longer, imagining the sound a workshop like this might make on a working morning. The particular music of planes and mallets and young voices arguing cheerfully about grain direction. Sounds this island had never once heard in all the years I'd kept it. Quiet and private and entirely mine. Outside the workshop window, the morning had fully arrived now. Pale gold light spreading slowly across the water, catching the wake of a lobster boat already well into its rounds, indifferent to villas and trusts and reckonings, simply going about the ordinary business of a Christmas morning like any other. I rolled the drawing carefully and set it beside the folder Dottie had prepared the night before, in the same drawer where I had kept the trust papers sealed for 27 years. Though this time I left the drawer unlocked. Uncertain for the first time in longer than I could remember whether keeping things sealed away had ever actually protected anyone at all. It seemed, on reflection, a fitting place to leave the question until I had a clearer answer, sitting beside the very papers that had raised it in the first place, unlocked and unfinished. And for now at least simply allowed to remain exactly that. The small hull still hangs in the workshop tonight, exactly where it has hung for 27 years, half-planked, half forgotten, catching the last thin light of a Maine winter through a window no one but me ever thinks to look through. The rope holding it creaks once faintly, the way it always does when the wind shifts outside. I have not touched it since Christmas morning. I am not certain even now whether I ever will. I used to believe that love, real love, had to survive a test before it could be trusted. That a father who gave everything freely was simply a father waiting to be robbed. I no longer believe that quite so certainly. I have come to think that some tests prove nothing at all about the person being tested, and everything about the fear of the one who designed them. Whether that fear was wisdom wearing a disguise or simply fear all along is a question I suspect I will keep circling for the rest of my life, the same way I keep circling that unfinished boat. The same way I imagine most of us circle the one relationship we were most afraid to get wrong. What I do know is this. Family is not a ledger, and love recorded only in what it withholds is a strange kind of love to hand down to a child who never asked to be tested in the first place, and never should have had to be. I think, too, of every quiet Christmas Eve I spent believing I was protecting something, when I was more honestly protecting only myself. And I find myself grateful in a way I never expected to, for a God patient enough to let a stubborn old man learn that lesson this late in his life. I have thanked God more than once these past weeks, not for the villa, not for the trust finally settled, but simply for one more morning to try answering the question differently than I answered it for 27 years. If there is mercy in this story anywhere, I believe it came from God long before it came from me. So I will ask you what I still cannot fully answer myself. If someone you loved forced you to prove yourself before they'd finally let you in, would you have kept knocking? Or would you have walked away and never looked back? I would genuinely love to hear which one you'd have chosen and why in the comments below. If this story found its way to something true in you, share it with someone who might need it tonight, and stay close for the next one. Thank you truly for staying with me until the very end.